Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We will be providing an overview of the Accountability Framework Initiative and the various ways to apply the Accountability Framework to set and implement responsible sourcing practices and achieve ethical supply chains. Today's webinar is hosted by Preferred by Nature, and joining us in partnership to deliver the content is AFI, the Accountability Framework Initiative, and the World Wildlife Fund, WWF. The idea for this webinar was sparked by the recent adoption of the Accountability Framework by various initiatives, in particular, the recent adoption by the Danish Soy and Palm Alliances. And this webinar was designed to support their members in understanding the framework and its application in practice. However, the scope of the webinar has since grown to include a wide audience and various types of businesses and organizations, all with the collective interest of sourcing raw forest and farm materials responsibly. My name is Gweneth Langdon, and I will be leading today's presentation with control of the slideshow and the Q&A box. All participants are muted, and the function to unmute has been disabled due to the number of participants we have in the audience. We want to try to avoid technical difficulties as much as possible. We ask that you submit questions via the Q&A box. You will see that when you go to the bottom of your screen. You should be able to see the option to submit Q&A. We will be pausing at scheduled breaks in the presentation to address your questions, and then we'll also have a final Q&A session at the close of the meeting. The webinar is being recorded, and it will be shared with all who registered, not only those in attendance, but all who registered. And we'll also be posting it publicly on Preferred by Nature's website and our various social media platforms. We welcome you to share it as well. So we will begin our webinar. I want to introduce you to our panelists that will be kicking things off. First, we have Adrienne Stork. She's Senior Manager at Accountability Framework Initiative, a staff member of the Rainforest Alliance. We then have Akiva Fishman, who's joining us. He's the Manager of Forest at WWF US. And then I will be closing the presentations, doing a presentation on Preferred by Nature and an overview of our sustainability services. So without further ado, Adrienne. Oh, sorry, the agenda, what we'll be covering, my apologies. We'll be going over the orientation to the Accountability Framework Initiative. This will be shared by both Adrienne and Akiva. We will then be getting started applying the framework and going over some case studies in practice. Finally, we'll be talking about supporting companies to apply the framework. And then our final Q&A. So once again, we will start.
Great, thank you so much, Gwen. Akiva and I will lead off this presentation by giving you a bit of an orientation to the Accountability Framework Initiative. Next slide, please. I think the logical place to start is where we are globally, recognizing that ethical supply chains are really no longer optional. We see investors calling for this worldwide. Some examples include Larry Fink's CEO letter, not only from last year, but the one he issued last month as well from 2021, reiterating that issues of sustainability are an investment risk. We have investors calling for mandatory human rights due diligence as well. We have seen for a number of years buyers calling for this also. Members of the Consumer Goods Forum, for example, a global commodity platform such as the Global Platform for Sustainable Natural Rubber. And then finally, we're seeing increasingly that governments are also poised to require this. And we know companies are looking at this very closely. We have right now in the EU a legislative proposal for mandatory due diligence being considered. We also have the UK Global Resources Initiative recommendation to consider due diligence that will be further debated this year. And even here in the US, we are starting to make some moves in this direction as well. Next slide. To address all of this, the Accountability Framework Initiative pulled together a coalition of civil society groups to try to reach consensus on what ethical supply chains look like, to provide the guidance that companies need to be able to confidently set policies, set implementation systems and protocols, and to report on their progress. This coalition pulled together in 2017, and we released in June of 2019 the Accountability Framework, which is a common roadmap and reference point that includes the guidance companies need in order to do this, as well as key definitions that underpin these activities. Next slide, please. The roadmap covers a commodity scope looking at deforestation, conversion, and human rights. And we look specifically at forest risk commodities, including beef, cocoa, palm oil, rubber, soy, pulp paper, and timber. The geographic scope is worldwide, though we are quite focused on tropical ecosystems to start. This scope includes, as I mentioned, deforestation, conversion of natural ecosystems, which may include savannas and peatlands, and respect for human rights, including workers' rights as well. And then finally, to give you a stronger sense of who is part of this robust coalition, we are now 23 members. Next slide, please. Including many groups that I'm sure you recognize on this screen, as well as many partners who work to provide the reporting and monitoring platforms that companies use, as well as other resources that support them in the implementation of their ethical supply chain policies. So we're very pleased to have such a large and robust coalition and to have the membership necessary to really support an integrated approach that includes environmental and human rights aspects of supply chains. Without further ado, then I'll pass it over to Akiva to talk a little bit more about what the accountability framework is aiming to achieve.
Thanks, Adrienne, and hi, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be with you today. So Adrienne just explained what the accountability framework is. So let me now take a few minutes to explain why it's important and why it's useful to you as companies. And a word of context here will be helpful, I think. When the AFI coalition members first got together to begin talking about developing an accountability framework, we were in the midst of a wave in which both companies were announcing their first deforestation-free commitments. And this was during the middle of the last decade. The AFI coalition members were really excited that companies were elevating the profile on forest protection and acknowledging their responsibility to take significant action. But at the same time, we were starting to see some major problems that were limiting the effectiveness of these corporate commitments on forests. And the first of these problems was a commitment gap. While many companies were making commitments to address deforestation and conversion, and I know that many of the companies that have signed on for the call today are among them, many other companies with exposure to deforestation risk through their operations or supply chains did not have commitments, and that's still true today. You can see from the diagram on the slide that in one study of 865 companies with exposure to deforestation risk, only 484 of them have commitments. That's about half. On top of that, there are widely varying levels of ambition among company commitments. Many commitments don't cover the full extent of a company's deforestation risk exposure because they're only scoped to address certain commodities or a subset of sourcing regions or business units. Other commitments lack any clear targets or milestones that would facilitate accountability to meeting the commitments. And then in many cases, commitments are unclear about the definitions they're using for key terms like forest or deforestation. Next slide, please. The second gap that AFI addresses is an implementation gap. We know that companies that made deforestation-free commitments have struggled to implement them. 2020 was a year that many people had their eyes on because so many global agreements in the public and private spheres referred to it as the deadline for eliminating commodity-driven deforestation, including the New York Declaration on Forests, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Amsterdam Declarations, and the deforestation target of the Consumer Goods Forum. But as we know, we collectively missed the deadline. 2/3 of tropical deforestation is still linked to forest risk commodities, and deforestation rates are rising in many parts of the world. This map is from WWF's new Deforestation Fronts report, which was just released a few weeks ago, and it highlights the extent of the remaining challenge, with red areas showing the parts of the tropics with the most severe deforestation. Next slide, please. The third gap that we found is an accountability gap. The problem here has been the lack of consensus on how to measure, assess, and report company performance against their goals, which inhibits accountability. Without a set of common definitions, metrics, and assessment tools, companies that are doing good work have had a difficult time credibly demonstrating this and gaining the benefits of their sustainability leadership. What we've had instead is a diversity of scorecards and other assessments that provide inconsistent signals to buyers, investors, and other stakeholders, which makes it difficult for them to effectively hold companies accountable to their commitments. The example on the slide shows how this has played out. Here we have two hypothetical scorecards, which are based on real scorecards, which evaluate the performance of a single large palm oil company. One scorecard gives the company an A rating because the company's got a strong record on traceability. The second scorecard gives the same company a C rating because of its lack of progress on certification. So this is indicative of how the accountability space has looked, leaving stakeholders unsure on how to decide whether to purchase from, support, or campaign against a given company. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is what the accountability framework was created for, to fill these gaps. To address the gap in company commitments, the accountability framework steps in to help companies understand how to set credible deforestation and conversion goals, including what elements need to be part of a robust commitment, how those commitments should be scoped and specified, and what definitions to use. AFI provides useful tools to help, including a set of definitions that have been agreed by a wide coalition of environmental and social NGOs, a self-assessment checklist that companies can use to see how well their existing commitments align with AFI's guidance, and a resource called How to Write a Robust Ethical Supply Chain Policy that includes a sample policy. And Adrienne is going to say a little bit more about those tools in a little while. The accountability framework also helps companies understand how to effectively and credibly implement deforestation and conversion commitments. Its guidance on traceability, supplier management, land use planning, and many more help companies chart a path to put their commitments into practice. And AFI provides tools and resources to help. For example, it has a tool for companies to self-assess their operational protocols for implementing their commitments. It offers a sample supplier code, and there will shortly be a new resource to help downstream companies develop supplier questionnaires. Finally, the accountability framework helps to simplify and inject consistency into the way that company efforts on deforestation and conversion are reported and assessed. For example, it offers a guide on how to use the framework to inform corporate reporting on agriculture and forestry supply chains. It also has a guide on how to use existing reporting systems that companies already use to credibly report on their commitments. Importantly, the AFI coalition has been working behind the scenes with many of the important stakeholders and standards and initiatives that companies work with and use to ensure that they align with the accountability framework, so that companies can align with the framework simply by using these other systems. And if we go to the next slide, I'll show you what I mean. This slide shows some of the many examples of key initiatives that are partially or fully aligned with the accountability framework, many of which you will probably recognize. What this alignment means is that companies can use the accountability framework as an overall approach to setting up ethical supply chains across their whole business, and then they can make use of these context-specific tools that are aligned with the framework to help implement different aspects of their commitments. For example, a company might use the high carbon stock approach to guide site planning and define no-go areas for crop expansion, and then they might use CDP forests to help report on their risk exposure, actions, and their progress related to forest risk commodities. This alignment also means that companies can use the accountability framework as a more detailed and practical guide to carry out their high-level commitments and obligations that they may have taken on board by signing on to initiatives like the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the Cocoa and Forest Initiative, or the New York Declaration on Forests. So I think this takes us to the end of section 1 of the webinar. Gwen, did you want to pause here to see if there are any questions on the content we've covered so far?
Yes, let's take a short pause and see if any questions. Let's move forward. No immediate questions. And of course, we'll have the Q&A at the end. So please submit questions throughout the presentation. If we don't address them throughout, we'll get them at the end. So moving forward.
Great. Thanks so much, Gwen. And thanks to Akiva for that. We'll now take you through the next section of the webinar, which is applying the accountability framework in practice. So if we move to the next slide, first and foremost, we wanted to give you a nice bird's eye view of the accountability framework. We'll go into depth then in each of these. The framework itself is broken into 3 steps of the ethical supply chain journey. For companies, this means the first step of setting and strengthening their goals or commitments. So they can use core principles 1, 2, and 3 that you see in blue on the screen, as Akiva mentioned, to help them to define the scope and content of their policies and commitments. This could be for setting new commitments or perhaps refreshing the ones they already have to align with the framework. Then the numbers in orange are the core principles of the framework that address implementation of ethical supply chains. This covers everything from company systems and processes, risk-based assessments, as well as land acquisition, land use planning, and management. So these principles are really designed for companies along the entire scope of the supply chain to guide them in implementation, whether they're at the production level, midstream as traders or manufacturers, or downstream as retailers. And then finally, a core principle 12 provides guidance for reporting, disclosure, and claims to guide companies in the way that they credibly report on progress towards their commitments. Next slide, please. And then as we look to provide you with a few practical examples, as we look at applying the framework, for example, you may use core principles 1, 2, and 3 to establish or update your company's supply chain commitments. If you've recently merged or acquired another entity within your company, or if you're assessing a new entity's policies, you may use these principles as well. You may as well be one of the companies in the category that Akiva mentioned earlier, where you have a commitment for a particular commodity or geographical scope, and you wish then to align with the framework and broaden that scope to cover your company's entire operations. Core principles 1, 2, and 3 can help you with this. When you're then looking at developing implementation systems, whether those are action plans, supplier codes, or protocols, or management systems, core principles 4 through 11 can support that. It can also help you to determine the appropriate level of traceability and how to address non-compliant suppliers. It can also help you to determine what types of tools to use to achieve your commitments. And I will talk about this in a few minutes, but certification is one example of a tool that is complementary to the accountability framework that you may use in tandem with the framework to achieve your supply chain goals, whether you have both certified and non-certified supply volumes within your supply chain. And then finally, core principle 11 very specifically helps to provide guidance that establish systems to monitor and verify progress so that you can credibly report on progress towards your commitments. And then finally, as Akiva mentioned, we have been working very closely with a variety of different reporting and assessment systems, scorecards, and others to help align this space for companies. And so, for example, if you haven't done as well as you'd like on CDP forest reports, or if you have been scored in different ways across different assessment systems, you can use the accountability framework's guidance to ensure that your own internal reporting systems are set and aligned with the framework, and can confidently know that these will then align with the different systems that are also collaborating with us. Also, if you're working to develop a sustainability report that's seen as credible by your buyers, or increasingly by investors who are asking for this as well, the accountability framework can help there too. Next slide, please. Now we'll dive a little bit more into certification specifically. Since the accountability framework is unique in that it provides guidance that can help companies to address their non-certified volumes, it's important to recognize the way that it works in tandem and in complementarity with certification systems. So the first key point here is around alignment. So, and the use of certification to meet ethical supply chain expectations. And to determine alignment there, 2 key issues need to be considered. The first is whether or not the certification standard what it requires in terms of performance at the supply base level. That means the farm or ranch or forest. And if these requirements are comparable to the respective accountability framework core principles, then we would consider the standard to be aligned. However, it is very important here to make the distinction between a certified product and a certified farm or forest. And since many certified products are mixed and could include both certified and non-certified volumes, it might not be possible to know what the performance of the non-certified volumes look like. So when you're looking at alignment with the framework and certification systems, we would say that for these volumes where compliance at the supply base level is known, then the certification can be used as a mechanism to meet ethical supply chain commitments as defined in the accountability framework. In terms of complementarity, the framework can be used as a reference for commodity production and sourcing that's not under a certification scheme, either because a robust standard is not available, or it's not practical to use in that context, or the company simply hasn't yet transitioned to certification for that particular volume. The other way we look at complementarity is that the framework includes principles and guidance that often extend beyond the scope of most certification standards. So the framework is still applicable whether or not you have certified volumes, and it can be used as an overall tool to help you manage your company's full scope for your commitments. Next slide, please. This is a graphic description of alignment and complementarity between the AFI and different certification systems. For example, we know that on the left, we see the different elements of an ethical supply chain as defined by the accountability framework. Across the top here, we've given a few examples of product supply chains where we know there are robust certification systems that exist. As you can see here, certification systems, even those which are aligned with the accountability framework, may not cover every topic that's included in the framework. So the accountability framework is still an important tool to use to ensure that your company has the proper policies and systems set up to fully align with ethical supply chains as defined in the framework. Gwen, if you could just click one more time here. This helps. Once more, this helps to see a little bit. The accountability framework, in fact, covers the entire scope of the elements on the left. And so if you're using that in complementarity with certification, then you can be confident that you are on track to be able to credibly demonstrate progress towards your commitments. For the next slide, please. To get started with the accountability framework, Akiva referenced several of the tools and resources that we have developed. All of these are available on the Accountability Framework's website. For example, if you're looking at assessing your company policies and systems against the consensus-based best practices that the framework contains, you can use our self-assessment tool to get started to identify any particular gaps that you may have in your policies and systems. And this tool can also point you towards the respective guidance within the framework that can help you to fill those gaps. You can also create and update your company goals using specifically our guide on how to write a strong ethical supply chain policy, which provides a stepwise approach to doing this using core principles 1, 2, and 3, and provides a sample policy as well for you to reference. And then finally, another way to get started is to understand the best practices in monitoring, disclosure, and reporting that align with the various sustainability reporting or scoring frameworks that are out there. And there are resources on our website that point towards these different tools and provide more details on how the framework works with and aligns with the various monitoring tools and reporting systems that are out there. Next slide, please. And then another resource that we have on our website as well are key topical summaries. So if your company in particular wants to know more about a specific topic within the framework, we have compiled the various guidances within the framework into topical summaries to make this easier for you. So these summaries cover the topics that you see here on the screen around deforestation and conversion and human rights, but also the different implementation topics that you may be interested in, including traceability, managing for supplier non-compliance, and others. We are also continuing to develop key topics, so do stay tuned to this particular part of our website as well for additional resources moving forward. And then finally, the next 2 slides, Gwen, we want to just give you a sense of what some of these tools look like. So this is our self-assessment tool. We have gotten some very helpful feedback as we've been using this tool with companies already, and do stay tuned for an Excel version of this tool that is more aligned to format that we know companies are keen to use. That will be available soon, but we do already have this a version on the framework's website for you to get started with. And then the next slide shows you a quick snapshot of our user guide on how to write a strong policy, including in the annex, as I mentioned, a sample policy for you to refer to. And now I'd like to hand back over to Akiva to discuss with you a few case studies we have of how the accountability framework has been applied in practice to date.
Yeah, thanks, Adrienne. So now that Adrienne has talked through how companies like yours can implement the accountability framework and some of the resources and tools that are available, I'm sure you're wondering whether any companies are already using the framework and how they're using it. So I'll give you a couple examples to illustrate some of the use pathways, and there are many, many more. So the first example I'll give comes from the paper sector. A large group of publishers, print suppliers, and paper manufacturers have come together as a coalition called the Book Chain Project, and they set a goal to collaborate on sustainable sourcing of wood fiber and to build better supply chains. The problem is that, and if you guys are in the paper sector on the call, you'll know a lot of the globally traded wood is implicated in illegal logging, conversion of high biodiversity ecosystems, and human rights violations. And publishers sit so far down the supply chain that it can be difficult for them to evaluate forest origins and supplier performance. What these companies did was to develop a methodology for assessing and scoring the performance of paper mills, which allows them both to make procurement decisions and to provide suppliers with roadmaps for improving their performance. In developing this methodology, the Book Chain Project members drew from the AFI's guidance on several topics, including risk assessment, supply chain mapping, traceability, supplier engagement, and monitoring. In addition, the questions that the methodology poses to mills that are being assessed borrow from AFI's guidance on how much information a company needs to have about the origins of its supply, depending on the degree of complexity of its supply chain. This comes straight out of the AFI guidance materials. Because the framework they are using to assess mills aligns with the accountability framework, the companies that are part of the Book Chain Project can be sure that the way they are assessing supplier performance fits with the consensus-based best practice agreed by the NGO community. And since developing this mill assessment framework in 2018, this company coalition has used it to guide on-site assessments of at least 10 mills across Asia and Europe. And this has led to increased engagement with business partners in a constructive manner in which downstream companies have been able to share best practices with their suppliers and help them build their capacity to deliver the product that's being asked of them. The second example is one in which an individual company, in this case Cargill, drew from the accountability framework in building a new supplier management tool for its Latin America-based palm oil suppliers. Cargill wanted to implement its palm oil policy, which commits to no deforestation, no peat, and no exploitation. But its very large number of suppliers meant that it needed an efficient way to gather data from them, to engage them, and to monitor their performance. To do this, Cargill built a tool that uses AFI's guidance on assessing suppliers for risk of noncompliance with the company's policy, as well as the guidance on how best to work with noncompliant suppliers to help them come into compliance. Built into the tool is a way for suppliers to securely upload their geographic coordinates and boundaries and then analyze them using global data sets like Global Forest Watch, as well as any local or regional data sets that might be available. Within the first couple of months of launching the new tool, 60% of Cargill's palm oil suppliers in Latin America were using it, and the company is now looking at ways to incentivize enrollment and considering the option of making participation mandatory. So that's an example of an individual company using parts of the framework to inform the tools and protocols that it was setting up on the inside. In the third example, another coalition of companies, in this case the UK Roundtable on Sustainable Soya, set out to establish an overarching sourcing goal that all of its members could work toward. Member companies initially struggled to finalize a goal out of fear that the definitions they chose might not line up with those used by others in the soy industry. But when they came across the accountability framework, they felt confident using it to progress their goal-setting discussions because of its consensus-based nature, created by a coalition of environmental and social NGOs and consulted widely among civil society and industry experts. The Roundtable ultimately committed to sourcing soy that is legal and cultivated in a way that protects against the conversion of forests and valuable native vegetation, which is in line with AFI's guidance, and they cited its definitions. And individual members were encouraged to use the accountability framework to set company-specific policies, which a number of member companies went on to do. The Roundtable set up an annual process in which member companies provide updates on their policies, risk assessment processes, and time-bound implementation plans. The most recent Roundtable annual report published this past November showed 70% of members had established a sourcing policy, and that the volume of certified soy that members were purchasing had doubled in 2 years. So there are just a couple of examples. Like I said, there are many, many more. Many of the organizations that are members of the Accountability Framework Initiative work one-on-one with companies. They work with industry associations. WWF is one of them. Preferred by Nature is one of them. The Accountability Framework Initiative's backbone team will also work with companies one-on-one. So lots of examples of companies using the framework in various ways. So if we go to the next slide, I think I'm handing back quickly to you, Adrienne.
Yes, great. Thanks, Akiva. We wanted to give you just a quick sense too of some of the resources again that we have if you'd like to get started in using the accountability framework. So if you do go to our website, which is accountability-framework.org, you can subscribe to updates from the coalition, which includes a regular newsletter. You can also sign up for our company learning webinar series. We have several recordings from webinars we did on different topics, including certification from last year, and we'll be continuing that webinar series this month with one on cocoa and following that on supplier engagement over this quarter. You can also feature your company's ethical supply chain story on the AFI website, where, as Akiva mentioned, many of our coalition members collaborate closely with companies. We're very keen to hear from you and to understand ways you might be applying the framework or ways that your own systems, like in the example of Cargill, may be aligned already with some of the framework's principles. And so we're keen to show these examples as a way to help other companies and peers to also develop their own methods of applying ethical supply chain commitments. And then finally, you can always reach out and contact us on the Backbone team if you'd like an introductory session to the framework or to answer any other specific questions. And with that, I'll pass over to Gwen.
Great, thank you so much, Adrienne and Akiva. There are 2 questions that have come in. I'll read the first one. It's about smallholders. There's an interest to understand a little bit more about how the accountability framework can be used by companies to ensure smallholders are included within target setting, traceability, and implementation.
Great. I'd be happy to take that question, and Akiva, please join in as well. The Accountability Framework Initiative certainly recognizes the important roles that smallholders play in agriculture and forestry supply chains. And that inclusion of smallholder producers is really critical, especially for support for livelihoods, as well as to increase productivity and to avoid displacement of certain social and environmental impacts as commitments are implemented along a supply chain. So in order to help facilitate smallholder inclusion, the Accountability Framework developed an operational guidance on smallholder inclusion in ethical supply chains. You can find this on our website. And this includes specific guidance on how different aspects of implementation and monitoring of supply chain commitments can be adapted to smallholder contexts, including around traceability, supplier engagement and support, as well as for assessment and retention of any non-compliant suppliers as well. So if you would like to take a look at that guidance on our website, and then please do reach out to us if you have further questions on integrating smallholders into supply chains.
I'll just note that I posted the link to that specific part of the guidance as an answer to the question. So feel free to click on that and check out the guidance. Just to reiterate, the top line message is AFI's stance is that smallholders have to be part of ethical supply chains. Otherwise, we're just cutting out major parts of the supply chain and doing it in an inequitable fashion. So that's a starting point. And then the guidance that I linked to and that Adrienne mentioned talks about how best companies can incorporate smallholders into their supply chains.
Great, thank you. I think when we send the recording of the webinar, we can also send a few links that will be directly to some of these key topics that have come up in questions and answers, the operational guidance for sure. The next question is more about mixed systems and certification. So many of the major sustainability certification systems have mixed approaches for the certified products in scope. We know this as mass balance. How how do you work with the AFI framework here? How do you interact? Companies that are sourcing or mixing products, how does the accountability framework apply?
That's a great question. So this gets back a little bit to what we spoke about with the alignment and complementarity of certification systems. In general, materials that are certified to standards and brought to market by a segregated or identity preserved supply chain model do fulfill the framework's expectations for ethical supply chains. As I mentioned, certified products often contain different volumes, and only if those volumes are able to be traced through a segregated or identity preserved supply chain model are they fully aligned with the accountability framework. That also means that certified materials or credits that use mass balance or booking claims signify certainly a contribution towards supporting ethical commodities, but might not demonstrate that those materials are in fact deforestation-free, conversion-free, and produced with respect for human rights. And this gets back to the accountability framework's guidance on for a risk-based approach to supply chains, and the guidance that we set out in our principles and operational guidance for companies to be able to assure and confirm that their volumes are in fact deforestation, conversion free, and free of abuses from human rights. So when you're looking at certification systems, segregated or identity preserved are those which are in alignment with the accountability framework. I will also mention as an aside that we are working closely with many different certification systems who are looking to more fully align with the framework. This includes, for example, the Roundtable for Responsible Soya, also Proterra's standard as well as many others, including the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, Forest Stewardship Council, and others. So we are in the process of working towards alignment with more and more certification systems. So do let us know if you have any specific questions around that, but the framework's guidance in particular on supply chain management should provide the detail that you need in order to determine if the certification standards that you're using are in fact are in alignment with the framework for your volumes. Akiva, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just build on that briefly by saying that what Adrienne is saying is not to say that mass balance or other credit systems have no value. They certainly have some value in helping to build the market for certified products. But ultimately, a company's goal is to be able to credibly say we have no deforestation in our supply chain. And so long as there is some sort of mixing of non-certified materials in the supply chain, that's a very difficult claim to make. So only segregated and identity preserved certification schemes are able to deliver that. So that's what we mean when we say that those are the ways that you can align with the accountability framework. And I see the follow-up question from somebody else: how can UK soy fulfill the AFI when the availability of segregated soy is not possible? So that's one of the challenges that we are confronting. How do we ensure that there is enough certified material to go around? So what AFI does is it frames certified materials, certification in general, as one of a bundle of tools that can be used to meet AFI's guidance. It's not to say that you have to use certification in order to fulfill AFI's expectations. You don't. It's a very good way to do it, assuming the certification system is credible and robust. But if there's a limit to the amount of certified volumes available, then AFI provides guidance on how companies can ensure that their other volumes that are not certified still meet AFI's guidance and ensure that there are no deforestation, no conversion, no human rights abuses.
Okay, we have one final question here, very similar. How do you deal with a resourced wooden-based material? It's not segregated, identity preserved. I think this is very similar to Akiva, if you want to confirm the answer that you just provided.
So the first thing to clarify is that it is possible to have 100% certified wood products. For example, the FSC 100% certified label means that there's only material in a product that comes from FSC certified forest land. So that is a possibility. I know that I work in the wood space, and the availability of 100% FSC certified product is not always available in all markets. So the answer there is like what I said before. AFI provides guidance on how to ensure that materials that may not be covered by the certifications that you're trying to work with, or if there's not enough certification to go around, that's what the guidance is there for. It kicks in and shows how companies can ensure that their other non-certified volumes still meet AFI's guidance on deforestation, conversion, and human rights.
Okay, clarification that the question meant recycled materials.
Because recycled materials don't come from land, they come from previous production processes, there's no concern with deforestation or conversion. There may be human rights concerns depending on how recycling plants function. This is not an area that I know a lot about, but there would be no concern of deforestation conversion for recycled materials because there's no impact on the land directly.
Maybe I can just add to that quickly, Gwen. You know, some of the other approaches that are being considered right now, and this, especially in the soy space, this is very much a live discussion, as Akiva mentioned, and in flux. But you know, looking at different jurisdictional or landscape approaches is another way that companies can try to assure that the volumes that they are sourcing are indeed are ethical and in alignment with the accountability framework. So we're working with a variety of initiatives and partners in different tropical regions around the world to contribute to this. So as those develops, we continue to stay involved. And then there's one other question perhaps we could dive into around compliance. This is a really important question for the accountability framework. The accountability framework itself is not a certification standard, so we don't have an assurance mechanism. So we wouldn't verify compliance for any non-certified producers with the accountability framework, but rather we're set up and aligning with different reporting platforms, different monitoring tools and assessment systems, so that companies can use those tools and systems to determine, to report on their progress and determine their alignment with the accountability framework. So the idea is that the framework's guidance is there for you to use, especially for your non-certified volumes, and that you would report on progress towards your commitments then through these aligned platforms and using the different aligned tools. And then maybe to the question on credible certification, since that's related to the topic we've been discussing, there is a page on our website that is specifically speaks to the framework alignment with different certification systems. And I'd be happy, Gwen, to provide you with that link so that you could share that with participants afterwards.
Great. Let's save the rest of the questions. I think those last two questions actually were a good segue into the final piece of the presentation, and then we can open up for as many questions as we have time for. To Adrienne's point about the accountability framework initiative not being a certification scheme, there are many organizations that make up the coalition that are service providers and are here to help companies navigate this journey of understanding and implementing the accountability framework. Preferred by Nature is where the organization that I work for. You may know us also formally as NEPCON. We are one of these service providers. We are not just a certification body. We also provide corporate advisory services, which we call tailored services. So I have a few slides here just to provide you an overview of what these services are and how they can help companies implement the accountability framework. So applying the framework, there's many ways to do this. We have sustainability services, which houses our certification services in addition to our corporate advisory services. Certification is a key tool to implementing and mitigating and monitoring and verifying your supply chain's performance. But so is other steps that you would need to take within your due diligence systems, as we like to call them, for sourcing materials. We also conduct mission-driven projects at the field level that can contribute, and also capacity building. We have quite an extensive training program that help different supply chain entities demonstrate or build their performance over time. Preferred by Nature works across various sectors and commodities. Here's an example of many of our focal commodities that you all know us very well from. These seem to be growing each year. We are really excited to be exploring some new commodities such as rice, which you'll see on this slide is our newest commodity that we are exploring through the Sustainable Rice Platform. Preferred by Nature, like many of the other supporting partners, has a global presence. We have a team all over the world. What this map is showing is where we have NEPCON offices, where we have staff presence, which is the lighter green, and then where we have partner organizations. So 250 full-time staff, 30 countries, 40 nationalities, a network of 200 consultants. We truly do have a global scope within our work. I should mention we work in many more countries that are presented for actual services than on this map, but this is actually where we're representative with staffing. A few final slides just to provide a very high overview of our support services. First, when we look at the accountability framework principle of implementation systems and processes, we help companies build these systems and the tools they need to be successful. Many of these systems, also known as due diligence systems for sourcing, they help manage the collection of supply chain data and the manage of supply chain performance and improvements. This includes working with non-compliant supply chains to continuously improve and meet expectations of the commitments. We are currently working with quite a few retailers in the EU, for an example, on these type of systems that we've developed in order to aid in complying with the EU timber regulation. Second is supply chain traceability. We help companies better understand their supply chains by engaging with their suppliers for them. So AFI Principle 5 states, origins of materials and supply chains are known or controlled to a sufficient extent to ascertain that the production and processing units of origin comply with the commitments or determine the issues to be resolved. What we do is work with your suppliers for you. We get the information you need and demonstrate traceability in order to assess risk. Our global team is really key to making this type of work successful. Their ability to connect with supply chain actors in various countries, speaking the local language, and understanding the regional legal requirements and issues. We have done this type of work in various different supply chains across various different commodities like sugar, timber, other agricultural crops. And the most popular geographies, I would say, for this work would be Brazil, China, Indonesia, and Vietnam so far. NEPCON is known for supply chain assessment and compliance via our risk assessment work. You may be familiar with our sourcing hub, where you'll see an image on this slide that shows our heat map for timber legality, where we conduct risk assessments at a country level in order to provide information to the public. Our sourcing hub is publicly accessible of what specific risks are within these countries. We represent a number of commodities on our sourcing hub. It's not all comprehensive for all different types of commodities, but includes timber, soy, palm oil, and cattle. We also conduct supply chain assessments, risk assessments for company supply chains. So this would be a more fine-grained risk assessment where you actually know the supply chain actors and the sourcing area, where we can help companies really have put a microscope on their supply chains to understand what are the actual risks that are applicable to them in their supply chains, so you can make informed decisions about how to manage those supply chains. But also what you can do is then know what type of mitigation measures to put in place. With all of our risk assessment work, we always provide recommendations for mitigation. Monitoring and verification. This is a direct result of our work over the past 25 years in certification. We are an independent verification body, whether it's to a certification scheme or independent verification of a company policy, of an independent standard, or elements of the accountability framework. We are well equipped with our global presence to conduct these evaluations at both the field level and at the supply chain level. So a few differences of what you would be looking for at the field level versus the supply chain. These are the ways that you can go and investigate current activity within your supply chains, but also get a read on whether they're meeting your commitments that you've set in place within your policies. So at the field level, you can understand the risks that are present within the sourcing areas and whether they are adequately mitigated by control measures. Where credible certification schemes are not in place, or the example for many of the questions before, where you do not have a segregated supply chain identity preserved from a certified land base. You can perform these type of verifications to be confident that management plans are being designed and implemented adequately according to what your policy expectations are. And finally, the very beneficial part of a field level visit is to conduct stakeholder consultation. This could be with affected parties to understand the impacts of the land management practice, but it also can be with the actual workers to understand the environmental and social impacts on workers and surrounding communities. Next, supply chain level verification. We do many of these. The goal of the supply chain verification usually is to identify risk of mixing, concerns about fraud and misclassification, and also trade compliance. But the supply chain level verifications can also look at social and environmental compliance at the manufacturing level. The final slide here, so I can leave some time for some final questions. All of these previous services that I have outlined help support the reporting, disclosure, and verification of claims that can be made publicly in the market. This can be through annual sustainability reports or other types of verification-based claims by credible verification bodies like Preferred by Nature to support these type of public statements. I have included a slide with some contact information for us. I'd like to bring attention, Michael Jakobsen, my colleague in Western Europe, is on the call too. Many of you know him and helped organize this webinar, so we're providing our contact information there. And we can wrap up the webinar now with a short pause to see if anybody has any questions, not just on the immediate presentation by Preferred by Nature, but on the presentation as a whole.
So I see there's one question from earlier about products coming out of China, including soy. So I would say that in one sense, we treat China the same as any other country. AFI guidance applies across the world to all geographies. Doesn't matter where products are coming from. They need to not have any deforestation or conversion or human rights abuses associated with their production or trade. So in that sense, China is the same as every other country, and the guidance would apply equally. But the other thing that I'd mention is that, because China is such an important trading hub for commodities that come from other places, companies need to take that into account when they are doing their traceability to ensure that the commodities they're buying originally came from places that didn't have deforestation or conversion or human rights issues. So in many cases, it won't be enough for a company that buys soy coming out of China or palm oil coming out of China to just stop there, because in many cases, China did not produce those commodities, but are simply a trading post. So companies would often need to go further back in the supply chain to ensure that wherever those commodities were produced originally, there were no issues. The accountability framework has a section of guidance on traceability that details the degree of traceability that's needed depending on the type of risk that is involved in the commodity, as well as different options for how to do the traceability. So for example, one option is to go all the way back to the farm level and make sure you know who the farmer is. That might be possible for companies at certain parts of the supply chain, but it's certainly not possible for downstream companies. So there are other options for how to do traceability, including going back to your own supplier to make sure that they have a compliance system in place to ensure that whatever they're buying doesn't come from areas that were deforested or converted. And there are other options as well. So I would direct you to the section of the Accountability Framework guidance on traceability to learn more about that.
Maybe I'll just complement what Akiva has said too, just to say that, you know, the Accountability Framework Initiative is working with partners in regions all over the world, including Brazil and other areas where soy is being sourced that ends up within the Chinese market. So we are trying to work up and down stream in the supply chains as well to support partners to try to align as much as possible when it comes to production and to try to help facilitate the type of traceability that Akiva is mentioning to the extent that we can.
I'd like to comment, since the question was specifically about China and soy. NEPCON has done a risk assessment on soy that is produced in China, not just manufactured or traded in China. And there are additional risks to deforestation that are a result of that risk assessment. It is publicly available on our sourcing hub. I can provide the sourcing hub links when I send around the recording, but it's important not to look at deforestation in a silo. There are other social and environmental risks that are present within supply chains that are covered by the accountability framework. It's also important to look at the type of source, whether it's a privately owned farm or a smallholder farm versus a government controlled farm or farms that hold certification. So there's a lot of complexity to understand the risks based on the source type. It's very uncommon that you can say a certain product is from a certain country and it's automatically low risk. Of course, there are scenarios, but I would say it's more uncommon than it is common. So I welcome everyone to look at the NEPCON sourcing hub to understand some of those risks that have been presented. All right, 2 questions with 3 minutes remaining. How do you see AFI influencing the growth of certification, meaning the transition of controlled sources to certified sources? Or said another way, is this an outcome of AFI is seeking to influence, or do you see it as complementary tool to controlled sourcing risk assessments?
I can start, and I'm guessing, Dave, that your question is coming from the FSC space since you're such a pro in that space, but this will be true for other commodity certifications too. So FSC is a bit different than some certifications because it has this controlled wood category that applies even if volumes are not kind of FSC certified. So it makes sure that even the non-certified stuff that is included in an FSC certified product at least meets some certain minimum criteria. And because those criteria include no deforestation, that is a pretty good indicator that in the case of FSC, even mixed products are much likelier to meet accountability framework guidance. And this might not be the case for other certification systems that don't have the equivalent of a controlled wood standard. Is AFI explicitly trying to sort of morph controlled wood or controlled other commodities into fully certified? I wouldn't say that's an explicit goal of AFI. In fact, AFI itself is agnostic on certification. Speaking from WWF, I have my own organizational take. We definitely support certification for lots of reasons. But from AFI's standpoint, AFI just wants companies to have no deforestation, no conversion, no human rights abuses in their supply chains. And certification is one way to get there, but it's not the only way to get there. So AFI is not necessarily pushing certification. It's acknowledging its value among other tools.
Yeah. Thanks, Akiva, for that. Gwen, I think you were just muted. But
I was. I do want to stay on time. I will provide a Q&A maybe with some answers after the question for the question about AFI complementing ITC. But I like the last question. I think we'll have time for this. It's about the integrity of the framework. The service providers seem to be simultaneously strongly linked to the steering group or the coalition rather than the steering group. To which extent does this create a danger of the framework being perceived as biased?
That's a really great question. We did present the coalition to you. I did not go into all the detail of how that coalition is parsed out. We have both steering group members and we have supporting partners. The steering group is the main governance body of the accountability framework. The steering group that we brought together in 2017 was the one responsible for achieving the consensus that resulted in the framework that is available now online in its current version. We do look to periodically update the framework as we get more and more feedback about the way it's being used, about any potential gaps in its guidance as it's being applied, but we don't anticipate any updates in the near term, at least this year. You can see on our website, if you go to who's involved, you will see the split between the steering group and supporting partners. Again, those in the steering group will be responsible for governance, including decisions around content of the framework moving forward, and the supporting partners are those that we collaborate to support uptake of the framework or its application and its integration into the various tools and systems and platforms that are relevant to its scope. For the steering group in particular, the organizations you will see on the site is not the complete list of those who were involved at the time the framework was developed in its current form, but we did have a very robust group of partners. We had organizations in the advocacy space, including Greenpeace. We have others with quite a bit of direct experience with companies, and we felt that bringing all of these groups together and making sure that the guidance built upon existing best practices in the voluntary space and served to really codify those practices into a single resource was a robust and useful contribution to the space overall. So in that sense, given that the framework itself is built on existing best practices and was also very widely consulted before it was launched, both in tropical producing regions where commodities are sourced, as well as with companies up and down the supply chain, government entities and others. We felt this gave it quite a lot of credibility. And so it's a great question, and we certainly do look to preserve the integrity of the framework as a consensus-based resource that represents, civil society positions and best practices around ethical supply chains going forward. I hope that helps to answer your question. If you have further questions about this, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Yes, and that goes for all participants. Any follow-up questions are welcome to any of us that are here as panelists. Everyone has my contact information from the webinar reminder. So please, we want to continue the conversation with you all. So with that, I think we'll close the webinar. Thank you again. Thanks to Adrienne and Akiva for joining Preferred by Nature on this webinar, and thanks to all who participated.